3 German Tiger tanks were climbing the road toward the village, and Corporal James Walker was the only American left with a bazooka between them and the infantry retreating behind him. The Shermans that had tried to hold the crossroads 10 minutes earlier were already burning wrecks along the hedgerow, their crews either pulled back or lying somewhere in the churned mud. What remained of Walker's platoon had been ordered to fall back across the stone bridge 200 yards behind the village square. If those Tigers reached the bridge before the engineers finished wiring the charges, the entire American withdrawal route would collapse. Walker knew exactly what that meant: German armor rolling straight through the valley while American infantry tried to retreat in open ground. The first Tiger appeared through the drifting smoke like a moving wall of steel, its massive turret turning slowly as it scanned the ruined street ahead. Even from 70 yards away, the tank looked enormous, wider than the road itself, its thick armor plates blackened with soot and dust. The second tank followed 30 yards behind, and the third moved slightly to the left, covering the flank with its cannon angled toward the shattered houses. They were advancing carefully but confidently. They believed the American resistance had already broken. Walker knelt behind a collapsed brick wall at the edge of the square, the bazooka resting across the rubble in front of him. The launcher felt heavier than usual in his hands, not because of the weight, but because of the reality of what he was about to do. He checked the single rocket already loaded into the tube and glanced at the canvas satchel beside him. 3 more rockets remained. 4 shots total. 4 chances to stop 3 of the heaviest tanks Germany had built. If he missed even once, the Tigers would close the distance too quickly for another attempt. The lead tank rolled closer, its tracks grinding across broken stone and shattered glass. Walker could see the machine gun mounted beside the cannon sweeping slowly across windows and alleyways, ready to shred any infantry that revealed themselves. He forced himself to breathe slowly and kept the bazooka pointed low. If the Germans spotted him too early, the turret would turn and the 88mm cannon would erase the entire wall in a single blast. Behind him he heard the distant shouts of engineers and the metallic clank of equipment as the bridge demolition team rushed to finish their work. They needed minutes. Walker looked back at the approaching armor and understood he might only be able to buy seconds. The first Tiger crossed into the open center of the square, its massive hull fully exposed between 2 burning Shermans. That was the shot he had been waiting for. Walker raised the bazooka slowly onto his shoulder and centered the sights on the tank's right track assembly, the one vulnerable place he could hit without facing the thick frontal armor. If he could cripple the lead vehicle, the other 2 would be forced to slow down or maneuver around it. That delay alone might save the bridge. He steadied the launcher, exhaled once, and squeezed the trigger. And the rocket blasted from the tube with a violent backblast that filled the street with smoke and flame. For a split second, Walker could see nothing but the rocket streaking straight toward the steel monster rolling through the square. If it missed, the Tigers would know exactly where he was. The rocket slammed into the lead Tiger's right track assembly with a sharp flash and a deep metallic crack that echoed through the ruined village square. For a fraction of a second, nothing seemed to happen. Then the track exploded outward in a violent spray of steel links and shattered roadstone, the blast ripping through the suspension and locking the massive wheel assembly in place. The 45-ton tank lurched sideways as its left track kept turning, while the right side collapsed beneath it. Smoke poured from the damaged section, and the machine ground to a grinding halt directly in the center of the road. Walker didn't stay to admire the result. The moment the rocket left the launcher, he dropped behind the broken wall and rolled across the debris toward the doorway of a shattered bakery 20 feet away. The backblast alone had announced his position to every German crew in the square. The second Tiger reacted instantly. Its turret spun toward the source of the launch in one smooth mechanical motion, and the coaxial machine gun erupted with a burst that tore through the brick wall Walker had just abandoned. Chunks of masonry exploded outward as bullets chewed the position to dust. If he had stayed there even 2 seconds longer, the burst would have shredded him. The third tank halted behind the crippled leader and angled its cannon toward the upper floors of the surrounding buildings, scanning for another launch. The Germans had not expected a lone infantryman to attack armor so directly, but the sudden loss of the lead vehicle told them something dangerous was hiding in the square. Walker ducked inside the ruined bakery and forced himself to move fast but quietly. The bazooka tube was already empty, the smoke curling from the back of it as he knelt behind a flour-covered counter. His hands worked automatically as he pulled another rocket from the satchel and slid it carefully into the launcher's rear. Outside, the crippled Tiger's engine roared angrily as the crew tried to reverse the tank off its damaged track, but the heavy machine barely moved. The destroyed track had jammed the suspension. The road was now blocked by 50 tons of immobile steel, exactly the obstacle Walker had hoped for. But the Germans were adapting quickly. Infantry began spilling from behind the second tank, spreading along the buildings with rifles raised. If they reached the bakery, they would either kill him outright or force him to abandon the launcher. And the two operational Tigers were already repositioning, their cannons searching the windows and doorways where the attack might have come from. Walker crouched beside a cracked window frame and carefully lifted the bazooka onto the sill. The second Tiger was edging forward now, trying to maneuver around the disabled tank by climbing partially onto the sidewalk. If it cleared the obstacle, both tanks would regain a clear path to the bridge. Walker centered the sight on the narrow side armor just behind the turret. It was a harder shot from this angle and farther away than the first one. If he missed, the tank would pinpoint the rocket trail and erase the bakery with one shell. Then he held the launcher steady and waited until the tank exposed just enough of its flank while climbing over the curb. The moment came quickly. The Tiger tilted slightly as its heavy track climbed the broken stone. Walker fired. The rocket streaked across the street and struck the tank just behind the turret ring with a bright flash that briefly lit the entire square. A deep boom rolled through the air as smoke erupted from the impact point. But this time the Tiger did not stop moving immediately. Instead, its turret began turning directly toward the bakery window where the rocket had come from. The moment the rocket struck the side of the second Tiger, Walker dropped away from the window and dove flat against the bakery floor. The explosion outside was followed almost instantly by the grinding sound of the tank's turret rotating toward the launch point. Even if the armor had been pierced, the crew inside would fire before abandoning the vehicle. Walker knew the rhythm of armored crews well enough to understand what was coming next. The cannon would not hesitate. A thunderous blast shattered the street as the Tiger fired. The shell punched through the bakery's upper wall and exploded inside the building, turning shelves, brick, and glass into a violent storm of debris. The blast lifted Walker from the floor and slammed him against the opposite wall. For several seconds he could hear nothing but a dull ringing in his ears and the crackling collapse of burning timber above him. Dust filled the room so thickly that the doorway vanished behind a gray cloud. But the building had not fully collapsed. Walker forced himself upright, coughing through the smoke. His hands moved automatically over the bazooka launcher, checking that the weapon had survived the blast. The tube was still intact, though coated with dust and powdered brick. More importantly, the rocket he had just fired had done something critical. Through the broken doorway he could see the second Tiger, now sitting motionless halfway across the street. Black smoke pouring from the engine vents behind the turret. The shaped charge had not blown the tank apart, but it had punched through the thinner side armor and ignited something inside. The turret had stopped turning. No machine gun fire followed. The crew inside was likely fighting flames or worse. 2 tanks down, one still advancing. The third Tiger did not hesitate. With the road partially blocked by the crippled leader and the burning second vehicle, the remaining tank angled sharply across the square, crushing a small wooden fence beneath his tracks as it maneuvered for a clear firing lane. The German commander had clearly decided that speed was now more important than caution. If he reached the bridge before Walker could fire again, the Americans would lose their only retreat route. Walker checked his satchel quickly. 2 rockets left. The Tiger's cannon swept slowly across the buildings. Pausing briefly on the ruined bakery where smoke still drifted from the hole blasted through the wall. The commander inside would know the attack had come from somewhere in that direction. If Walker fired from the same window again, the tank would likely fire first. The 88mm gun could level the entire building with a single hit. He needed a new angle. Walker slipped through the rear of the bakery and moved quickly along a narrow alley between 2 damaged houses. Walker climbed over a collapsed fence, and Walker climbed over a collapsed fence and emerged behind a stack of firewood beside a small stone well. From this new position, he had a clear view of the tank's rear quarter as it passed between the burning Shermans. The rear armor was thinner there, but the shot would be difficult. The Tiger was moving again, slowly but steadily. Voice in the distance was increasing every second. Walker slid the third rocket into the launcher and rested the tube across the well's stone rim. If this shot failed, the Tiger would reach the bridge in less than a minute, and there would be nothing left to stop it. Walker steadied the bazooka across the cold stone rim of the well and tracked the moving tank through the simple iron sight. The Tiger's engine roared as the crew pushed it forward through the narrow space between the burning Shermans and the crippled leader, blocking half the road. Even damaged armor could still fight, but the German commander had clearly decided that reaching the bridge mattered more than stopping to hunt a hidden infantryman. If that tank cleared the square, the engineers would never finish wiring the explosives in time. Walker forced his breathing slow and kept the launcher perfectly still as the tank's rear quarter slid across his field of view. The vulnerable engine compartment sat beneath thick grates and armored panels, not an easy target, but it was the only place he could strike without exposing himself long enough for the cannon to respond. The tank rolled forward another 10 feet. Walker squeezed the trigger. The bazooka roared, and the rocket streaked low across the rubble-strewn street before slamming into the Tiger's rear engine housing with a violent flash. For an instant, the massive vehicle continued moving as if nothing had happened. Then black smoke erupted from the back of the hull, and flames began licking through the engine vents. The tank slowed, shuddered, and stopped completely as its engine seized under the damage. The turret spun wildly for a moment as the crew tried to locate the attacker, but the sudden fire inside the compartment forced them to open the hatch instead. One German crewman burst out of the top hatch, coughing smoke, and dropped to the ground behind the tank. Another followed seconds later, dragging himself down the side of the turret. Walker did not fire again. He had only one rocket left, and it was not loaded, so the launcher hung empty in his hands as he ducked back behind the stone well and waited to see whether the crew would abandon the tank or try to keep fighting from the burning hull. But the crew was already scrambling away from the machine, retreating toward the tree line at the edge of the village. The fire had spread too quickly. The Tiger was finished. For the first time since the tanks entered the square, the battlefield went strangely quiet. The 3 Tigers now sat crippled across the road leading to the bridge, one with its track destroyed, one burning from a side penetration, and the last disabled by a damaged engine compartment. Walker finally allowed himself a single glance back toward the road behind him. Through the drifting smoke, he could see American engineers still crouched along the bridge supports, running wires and attaching demolition charges beneath the stone structure. They were working faster now, knowing the tanks had been stopped, but they still needed a little more time. Walker reached down and pulled the final rocket from his satchel, sliding it carefully into the bazooka tube. If German infantry arrived to clear the tanks from the road, he might still need it. His hands trembled slightly from the adrenaline and the concussion of the earlier blast, but he forced them steady. The battle was not completely over yet. Because German tanks rarely moved without infantry nearby, and if those soldiers pushed into the village now, Walker would have to hold the square a little longer. Walker had barely finished loading the final rocket when he heard the sound he had been expecting. Boots and shouted German voices moving through the tree line beyond the square. The tank crews had not advanced alone. Infantry always followed armor, using the tanks as moving shields while they pushed through contested ground. When the 3 Tigers stopped, the infantry behind them had been forced to slow down. Now they were catching up. Walker crouched lower behind the stone well and watched through the drifting smoke as shapes began appearing between the shattered houses at the far end of the road. German soldiers spread out cautiously, rifles raised, scanning the buildings where the bazooka attack must have come from. They saw the tanks immediately. One soldier ran toward the first Tiger, inspecting the destroyed track. Another group gathered around the second tank, where black smoke still poured from the side of the turret, and the burning third vehicle crackled loudly as flames spread across the engine deck. The infantry understood quickly what had happened. Someone in the village had stopped their armor. Now they would hunt whoever had done it. Walker stayed perfectly still. The bazooka across his knees suddenly felt enormous compared to the narrow space hiding him. If even one soldier spotted the launcher tube above the well, they would fire or throw grenades into his position before he could react. Then he counted at least 15 Germans spreading through this square already, with more shapes moving behind them through the smoke. The tanks had failed, but the infantry could still clear the village and reopen the road long before the bridge demolition was finished. A group of 4 soldiers moved cautiously toward the bakery where the second rocket had been fired. They entered the building with rifles ready, stepping over shattered bricks and splintered wood. Walker knew what they would find there: the blasted wall, the empty firing position, and the backblast marks burned into the floor. Once they realized the attacker had moved, they would begin sweeping the rest of the square house by house. Walker raised the bazooka slowly and aligned it toward the center of the street, where several German soldiers were now gathering, beside the disabled lead tank. The last rocket was not meant for another Tiger, and waited until the largest cluster of infantry the way it could armor, but the explosion would be violent enough to scatter them and buy the engineers the final seconds they needed. He waited until the largest cluster of soldiers moved close together, while examining the tank's broken track. The moment they stood fully exposed, Walker fired. The rocket blasted from the launcher and struck the road beside the group in a burst of flame and dust that threw men in every direction. The 2 soldiers fell immediately while the others dove for cover behind the disabled tank. Shouts erupted across the square as rifles snapped toward the well. Walker dropped flat behind the stone rim just as bullets began hammering the rocks above his head. He had no rockets left now. The bazooka was an empty tube in his hands. But the explosion had done what he needed. The German infantry scattered, uncertain how many American soldiers were hidden in the village. But the confusion slowed their advance, just as the sound Walker had been waiting for echoed from behind him. A sharp whistle cut through the air, followed by a deep rumbling crack from the bridge behind the square. The demolition charges had finally been triggered. The explosion from the bridge was unlike the sharp crack of artillery or the deep blast of tank guns. It was heavier, longer, a rolling concussion that shook the entire valley as if the ground itself had split open. Walker felt the shock wave pass through the stone well beneath his hands, while a column of dust and shattered masonry erupted into the air behind the village. For a moment, even the German infantry froze. The sound carried across the square like a thunderclap that refused to end. Then the center of the bridge collapsed inward with a grinding roar as tons of stone dropped into the river below. The retreat route was gone. Walker lifted his head carefully above the well just enough to see the result. The once solid arch now hung broken in the middle, its span shattered and sagging into the icy water beneath it. Engineers sprinted back from the blast site while chunks of rock continued sliding down the riverbank. Even if German tanks managed to push through the village now, but the crossing they needed had vanished. The road beyond the square ended in empty air. The German infantry understood it at the same moment. Confusion rippled through the group gathered around the disabled tanks. Several soldiers ran toward the edge of the square to look toward the bridge, only to stop when they saw the gap where the crossing had been seconds earlier. Their armored spearhead had been halted, and the path forward destroyed. Whatever momentum their attack had carried into the village disappeared instantly. A few riflemen still fired sporadically toward the buildings, searching for the American who had disabled the tanks. But the urgency was gone. Without the bridge, the advance had lost its purpose. German officers shouted orders as soldiers began pulling back toward the tree line, dragging wounded men away from the smoking wrecks of the Tigers. Then the battle that had seemed seconds away from breaking through the village had ended abruptly, in a stalled road full of crippled armor. Walker stayed behind the well until the last of the rifle fire faded. Only then did he slowly rise, the empty bazooka still resting across his shoulder. The square looked different now that the shooting had stopped. Smoke drifted lazily between ruined buildings, while the 3 Tiger tanks sat silent in the road, like enormous statues of burned to steel, and one leaned sideways where its track had been blown apart. Another still smoldered from the side penetration. The last remained frozen in place, with blackened engine vents and its crew nowhere in sight. Footsteps approached from behind as American infantry moved cautiously back into the village. A sergeant stopped beside Walker and stared at the road ahead for several seconds before speaking. "You did all this?" Walker shook his head slightly and lowered the bazooka from his shoulder. "Just slowed them down." The sergeant looked toward the broken bridge and then back at the disabled tanks scattered across the square. He nodded once, understanding exactly what the delay had meant. If the Tigers had crossed before the explosives were ready, the German advance would have pushed straight through the valley. Instead, the attack had stalled in a single ruined street. 3 Tiger tanks had entered the village expecting to break the line. 1 bazooka gunner had been waiting. American soldiers moved carefully through the village after the bridge explosion. Rifles raised as they checked doorways and shattered windows for any remaining German infantry. The firing had faded, but no one assumed the danger had completely passed. Walker stepped away from the stone well and leaned the empty bazooka against a broken fence, while he watched the platoon spread out across the square. The 3 Tiger tanks still dominated the road like enormous steel barricades, as their massive hulls scarred and smoking. Up close, they looked even larger than they had during the fight, thick armor plates blackened by soot and impact marks. 1 infantryman climbed cautiously onto the crippled lead tank and examined the shattered track assembly where Walker's first rocket had torn the suspension apart. The sergeant who had spoken to Walker earlier walked slowly along the line of disabled armor, studying each tank in silence. When he stopped beside the burning second Tiger and looked up at the black hole punched through its side armor. Flames still licked through the open hatch, while smoke poured into the gray sky above the village. "Bazooka did that," one soldier muttered quietly, almost as if he didn't believe it. The sergeant nodded once without answering. Everyone standing there understood how rare it was for a single infantryman to stop even 1 Tiger tank in open ground, let alone 3 in the span of a few minutes. Walker sat down on a pile of broken bricks near the bakery and finally allowed himself to breathe normally. His hands still trembled slightly from the recoil and adrenaline. When the tanks had first appeared through the smoke, he had not been thinking about heroics or strategy. He had simply understood that if the armor reached the bridge before the charges were ready, the American retreat would turn into a disaster. The only weapon left between the Tigers and that crossing had been the bazooka resting on his shoulder. Everything after that had happened quickly: load, aim, fire, move, repeat. Behind him, the destroyed bridge continued collapsing piece by piece as loose stones slid into the river below. Engineers and infantry gathered along the ridge overlooking the gap, making sure the demolition had completely blocked the crossing. Even if German engineers arrived later with equipment, rebuilding the bridge under artillery fire would take days. For now, the valley road had been sealed. The village itself remained quiet except for the crackling of burning fuel inside the second Tiger and the distant rumble of artillery somewhere beyond the forest. American troops began establishing new defensive positions along the edge of the square, using the wrecked German tanks themselves as cover. Ironically, the armor that had been sent to break the line was now helping hold it. Walker eventually stood and picked up the empty bazooka again. The launcher felt lighter now that the fight was over. As he looked across the square one last time, the scene made something clear. 3 Tiger tanks had advanced toward the bridge, expecting the village to fall quickly. Instead, they had met 1 infantryman who refused to move. And sometimes in war, that single refusal is enough to stop an entire advance. By late afternoon, the smoke over the village had thinned enough for American units to see the road clearly again. Engineers had finished securing the demolition site at the river, while infantry spread out through the surrounding buildings to establish a defensive perimeter. The 3 German Tiger tanks still sat in the middle of the square, exactly where they had stopped hours earlier, each one telling a different part of the fight that had taken place. The lead tank leaned slightly to one side where its track had been blown apart. The heavy steel links scattered across the road like broken chains. The second vehicle remained blackened and silent, the hole in its side armor still glowing faintly from the fire that had burned inside the crew compartment. The third tank looked almost untouched from a distance, but the rear engine deck was scorched and warped from the blast that had killed its engine and forced the crew to abandon it. And American soldiers moved cautiously around the disabled armor, examining the machines with a mixture of curiosity and disbelief. Tiger tanks had a reputation on the battlefield that made most infantry instinctively avoid them. Thick armor, a powerful 88mm cannon, and the ability to dominate open ground had made them one of the most feared weapons Germany possessed during the war. Yet here in a single ruined village square, that 3 of them had been stopped before they could even reach the bridge they were sent to capture. Walker stood nearby, with the empty bazooka resting against his shoulder, while mechanics from a supporting unit inspected the tanks. One of the mechanics ran his hand across the hole in the side armor of the second Tiger and shook his head slowly. "Right through the plate," he muttered quietly, almost impressed by the damage. Another soldier pointed toward the destroyed track on the lead vehicle, noting how the rocket had hit the exact weak point that immobilized the entire machine. None of them needed a long explanation to understand what had happened. The bazooka had done exactly what it had been designed for: give infantry a fighting chance against armor that otherwise would have rolled over them. Across the square, the sergeant who had first spoken to Walker earlier gathered the platoon together and briefly explained the situation. And German forces had already begun pulling their infantry back into the forest once they realized the bridge had been destroyed and the road blocked by their own disabled tanks. Without the crossing, their attack route through the valley was finished for the day. Other American units were already moving up behind the village to reinforce the line. The fight that had started with 3 advancing Tigers had ended with the entire German push stalled outside a single square of ruined buildings. Walker listened quietly as the platoon prepared to move again. There would be more fighting ahead somewhere else along the front. The war was full of places like this village, locations that would never appear on large battlefield maps, but still determined how quickly an army could move. What had happened here would not change the entire war, but it had changed the outcome of this advance. The tanks that were supposed to break the line had become obstacles instead. When the platoon finally marched out of the square, the 3 Tigers remained behind as silent reminders of how quickly momentum can vanish in combat. A road that had looked unstoppable a few hours earlier now ended in wreckage and smoke, and it had taken only one bazooka gunner to make that happen. By the next morning, the village road was quiet again, but the 3 Tiger tanks still sat where they had died the day before. Snow had begun settling lightly across their steel hulls, covering the burned metal and scattered debris that marked the fight. American engineers had placed warning markers around the destroyed bridge, while infantry units moved steadily through the valley to reinforce the new defensive line beyond the village. And the German advance that had pushed so confidently toward the crossing had ended in a single stalled column of armor that could no longer move forward or backward. Soldiers passing through the square slowed down when they saw the tanks. Even experienced infantrymen rarely stood this close to Tigers that were not firing back. The machines were enormous, their armor thick and scarred. Their cannons still pointed toward the road that no longer existed, and it was easy to understand why German commanders trusted them to break through enemy defenses. Under normal circumstances, a single Tiger could force an entire platoon of infantry to scatter. 3 of them advancing together were supposed to guarantee the road ahead would open. But the battlefield had changed in a matter of minutes. One rocket had destroyed the track of the lead tank and blocked the road, and another had punched through the side armor of the second vehicle and set it burning in the middle of the square. The final shot had crippled the engine of the third tank just as it tried to push past the wrecks. By the time German infantry arrived to secure the area, the bridge they needed to cross had already collapsed into the river behind the village. The stalled tanks now served as obstacles instead of weapons, and their massive hulls prevented any other German armor from using the road even if the bridge had still been intact. What had begun as a confident armored push had ended as a dead end in the middle of a ruined street. Walker passed through the square one last time with the rest of his platoon as they moved toward a new position further along the front. The bazooka hung across his shoulder again, freshly loaded this time, but the weapon looked ordinary compared to the steel giant sitting in the road. He did not stop to study the tanks the way some of the other soldiers did. For him, the moment had already passed. During the fight, there had been no time to think about the size of the armor or the reputation of the Tiger tank. There had only been a bridge behind him, 3 advancing machines ahead of him, and 4 rockets in a canvas bag. The road through the village had looked unstoppable when the tanks first appeared through the smoke. Yet it had closed just as quickly. The bridge was gone, the tanks were silent, and the German advance had been forced to find another path somewhere else along the front. 3 Tiger tanks had entered the square expecting to break the American line. Instead, they found one bazooka gunner waiting for them,